On the 28th of November, 1979, a sightseeing flight with 257 people disappeared in Antarctica. Air New Zealand Flight 901, a DC-10 aircraft, flew into the lower side of Mount Erebus, an active volcano covered by ice and clouds. Everyone on board was killed. At first, the cause seemed like a pilot error, but that explanation did not hold. As investigators studied the crash more closely, they realized the cause was more serious than it first appeared. The problem was not just in the cockpit, it began far away, long before the flight took off. Navigation data had been changed without warning. Important information was not shared. Systems meant to protect the crew had failed. The natural conditions in Antarctica made flying more dangerous. The snow and ice reflected so much light that the ground and the sky looked the same. This removed the visible horizon, which pilots normally use to judge height and distance. Because of this, mountains could blend into the background and become almost invisible, even when the weather was clear. The official investigation found that the crash did not happen because of a single error or one person's mistake. Instead, it happened because many small problems and failures made by different people and systems combined over time. These failures began inside the airline's offices, continued through planning and navigation, and finally ended at Mount Erebus in Antarctica. This video breaks down how a routine sightseeing flight to Antarctica turned into one of aviation's most disturbing disasters. In 1977, Air New Zealand launched an ambitious new idea: sightseeing flights to Antarctica. Using the long-range capability of the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, the airline offered passengers a rare chance to see the frozen continent from the air. These were luxury day trips departing Auckland in the morning, refueling in Christchurch, and returning the same evening. The flights were not advertised as simple transportation from one place to another. Instead, they were promoted as learning experiences, where passengers could gain knowledge, see landmarks, and understand Antarctica almost like an aerial tour or classroom in the sky. An Antarctic guide was on board, pointing out landmarks and explaining the landscape over the public address system, while passengers photographed the endless white below. Behind the scenes, these operations depended on a navigation system known as the Area Inertial Navigation System. Using multiple computers, it guided the aircraft along a series of precise geographic coordinates, essential in a place with no radio beacons, no landmarks, and no margin for error. Despite flying in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth, the program appeared to be a success. By 1979, Air New Zealand had completed 44 Antarctic flights, carrying more than 10,000 passengers. But that success came with a cost. Over time, confidence turned into complacency. Polar-specific training was treated as routine. Navigation data management became casual. And the hidden risks of Antarctic flying were slowly underestimated, setting the stage for a tragedy that would expose how fragile the system really was. These Antarctic flights were not cheap. In 1979, a ticket cost 359 New Zealand dollars, a premium price that would equal more than $2,500 today. Passengers weren't just buying a flight, they were buying a promise. Air New Zealand's advertisements showed aircraft flying low over Antarctica, offering dramatic views of ice, mountains, and volcanoes. Those images created quiet pressure to deliver the kind of close-up experience passengers had paid for, even when it meant operating near the limits of safe altitude. But the true danger was not in the air. It was buried inside a computer. To understand the crash, investigators had to trace the history of the flight's navigation data, specifically the waypoints stored in Air New Zealand's ground-based computer system. More than a year before the accident, when the Antarctic routes were first computerized, a simple typing error was made. One coordinate was entered incorrectly, shifting the destination waypoint 27 nautical miles to the west. Ironically, that mistake made the flight safer. Instead of passing over Mount Erebus, the altered route guided aircraft down the center of McMurdo Sound, well clear of the mountain. Every Antarctic flight for more than a year followed this unintended but safe path, even though official charts and crew briefings showed something different. Then, on the night before Flight 901 departed, someone noticed the discrepancy. At 1:40 a.m., the navigation section corrected what they believed was an error. The coordinates in the ground computer were changed to match the official route, a route that passed directly over Mount Erebus. But one critical step was missed. The flight crew was never told. They boarded the aircraft, believing they would fly the same safe path used on every previous Antarctic flight. In reality, their programmed track had been shifted 45 kilometers east, placing them on a collision course with an active volcano without their knowledge. By the time the aircraft took off, the system had already failed. There was now a complete disconnect between what the crew believed and what the aircraft was actually programmed to do. Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson had attended a detailed briefing earlier in the month. In that briefing, the flight path was described as a safe, westerly route down McMurdo Sound, well clear of Mount Erebus. On the morning of the flight, when the pilots entered the navigation coordinates, they believed they were confirming that same safe track they had studied and discussed. What they did not know was that the data had been changed. Unseen and undisclosed, the computer was now guiding the aircraft toward Mount Erebus itself, a 12,448-foot active volcano rising directly in their path. From the cockpit, everything appeared normal. But the aircraft was no longer flying the route the crew thought it was. And in Antarctica, that difference was fatal. During the pre-flight briefing on November 9, the pilots were given flight plan printouts from earlier Antarctic trips. Those plans showed a route running straight down McMurdo Sound over flat sea ice, with no high ground in the way. That information shaped their expectations. Investigators later described it as a powerful mindset. The crew believed that as long as the aircraft stayed on its programmed navigation track, there was no terrain below them that could pose a threat. But the briefing created another problem: confusion over altitude. Officially, the instrument flight rules required the aircraft to remain above 16,000 feet. At the same time, the crew was briefed on a visual descent procedure that allowed them to descend to 6,000 feet and possibly even lower if cleared by air traffic control at McMurdo. Two different standards, two different messages. Over time, company culture reinforced the lower option. Promotional images, passenger expectations, and the experience of previous crews all encouraged flying closer to the surface, offering better views, but leaving less margin for error. The crew's inability to see the mountain ahead was not caused by poor weather or limited visibility. In fact, visibility was more than 20 kilometers. What they encountered was something far more deceptive: an optical illusion known as sector whiteout, a phenomenon unique to polar regions. Sector whiteout is not a storm. It does not reduce visibility in the usual sense. Instead, it removes depth and contrast. It occurs when two conditions come together: a uniformly overcast sky and a snow-covered landscape with no variation in color. On the day of the crash, Flight TE-901 was flying under complete cloud cover. Sunlight was scattered evenly through the clouds and reflected off the endless snow and ice below. The result was a world without shadows. In those conditions, the rising slope of Mount Erebus, covered in white glacial ice, blended seamlessly into the white clouds and the white horizon. To the human eye, the mountain simply disappeared. From the cockpit, the view ahead looked flat and open, like an endless sheet of sea ice stretching into the distance. Photographs taken by passengers just seconds before impact confirm this illusion. The aircraft was flying in clear air, well below the cloud base. Landmarks were visible off to the sides, reinforcing the crew's belief that they were safely over McMurdo Sound. That is the cruel paradox of sector whiteout. It creates a powerful sense of confidence. The pilots believed they could clearly see a safe path ahead, when in reality, they were flying straight toward a massive mountain that was invisible against the background. For the first several hours, Air New Zealand flight unfolded exactly as planned. The aircraft departed Auckland at 8:21 a.m., climbing smoothly and heading south. Nothing about the early stages of the flight suggested trouble. As the DC-10 approached the Ross Sea around midday, the crew established radio contact with U.S. Navy air traffic controllers at McMurdo, known as Mac Center. The pilots requested permission to descend so they could see the terrain below. Mac Center approved the request. The controllers believed the aircraft was following the standard route down McMurdo Sound, well clear of high ground. What they did not know was that Air New Zealand's computer system no longer transmitted precise coordinates. It sent only a general position label, McMurdo. As a result, Mac Center had no way of knowing the aircraft was actually 27 miles east of where everyone believed it to be. At 12:35 p.m., the crew performed a wide figure-8 maneuver through a break in the clouds. Below them, they believed they were flying over water. The aircraft descended from 10,000 feet to 2,000 feet. 10 minutes later, the crew made their final radio call, reporting they were at 6,000 feet and continuing their descent under visual conditions. Inside the cockpit, there was no sense of urgency. The cockpit voice recorder captured calm conversation. The pilots discussed landmarks they believed they could see features that matched their mental picture of McMurdo Sound. Everything appeared normal. Then, at 12:49 p.m., the illusion collapsed. The ground proximity warning system suddenly activated. Data analysis shows the crew reacted almost instantly within 1 second. Throttles were advanced to full power, and the aircraft began to climb. But at that altitude, with the aircraft weighing more than 130 tons, there was not enough performance to escape. The aircraft struck the slope of Mount Erebus at approximately 260 knots. The flight ended in seconds. The crash site on the slopes of Mount Erebus, combined with Antarctica's extreme conditions, turned the recovery effort into one of the most challenging operations in aviation history. The mission was given a name: Operation Overdue. Investigators, volunteers, and New Zealand police officers were sent into one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with a single goal: to recover and return the remains of the 257 people who had lost their lives. The wreckage lay on the mountainside, more than 1,500 feet above sea level, surrounded by unstable glacial ice and unpredictable weather. Temperatures remained well below freezing, and visibility could change without warning. For nearly 2 weeks, recovery teams worked in exhausting conditions. The force of the impact and the fire had scattered the aircraft across the slope, leaving wreckage and remains fragmented and difficult to identify. Specialist disaster victim identification teams were brought in to manage the process. In the end, they recovered 114 substantially intact bodies, along with 133 bags of remains, each requiring detailed forensic work to ensure correct identification. Among the items recovered were personal belongings from the cockpit, including a ring binder belonging to Captain Jim Collins. These seemingly ordinary objects would later play a crucial role in the Royal Commission of Inquiry. The search for the cause of the Mount Erebus disaster did not produce a single answer. Instead, it produced 2 very different conclusions, each reflecting a different way of thinking about aviation safety. Together, they would divide New Zealand for decades. The first official investigation was led by Ron Chippendale, head of the Office of Air Accidents Investigation. His report, released in May 1980, focused squarely on the actions taken inside the cockpit. Chippendale concluded that the probable cause of the crash was the captain's decision to continue flying at low altitude in an area where surface features were poorly defined without being fully certain of the aircraft's position. At the center of his findings was altitude. He argued that the flight violated the minimum safe altitude of 16,000 feet. According to the report, had the aircraft remained at or above that altitude, the navigational error would not have mattered. The DC-10 would have passed safely over Mount Erebus. In this view, the coordinate error and other systemic issues were treated as secondary. Ultimate responsibility rested with the flight crew, specifically with the decisions made by Jim Collins in the final minutes of the flight. The Chippendale report reflected a traditional approach to accident investigation, one that sought answers in individual performance and cockpit decision-making. But it would not be the final word. And for many, it raised more questions than it answered. The conclusions of the first investigation sparked immediate backlash. Pilots, aviation professionals, and organizations, including the New Zealand Airline Pilots Association, challenged the idea that the crash could be explained by cockpit decisions alone. The pressure led to a second, far more powerful inquiry. A Royal Commission of Inquiry was established, led by Peter Mahon. Justice Mahon approached the case from a different starting point. Rather than asking what the crew did wrong, he asked a deeper question. How could an experienced, competent crew be placed in an impossible situation? After months of investigation, Mahon reached a stark conclusion. He ruled that the single dominant and effective cause of the disaster was the secret alteration of the flight's navigation coordinates and the failure to inform the aircrew that the route had been changed. In his findings, Mahon completely cleared the pilots of responsibility. He stated that the crew had every reason to trust the navigation data they were given, and no reason to suspect the aircraft was being guided toward danger. But the report went further. Justice Mahon accused Air New Zealand of deliberately attempting to hide its administrative failures. He described the airline's conduct as a predetermined plan of deception and characterized its testimony as an orchestrated litany of lies. Those words would echo far beyond the inquiry, becoming some of the most famous and controversial phrases in New Zealand's legal history. Justice Mahon's conclusions triggered an immediate legal response. Air New Zealand challenged the Royal Commission's findings, taking the case to New Zealand's Court of Appeal. The airline argued that Mahon had gone too far, claiming he had breached the principles of natural justice. At the center of the dispute was Mahon's accusation that airline officials had engaged in deception and perjury. Air New Zealand argued that those individuals had never been given a fair opportunity to respond to such claims during the inquiry. In December 1981, the Court of Appeal ruled in favor of the airline. The court overturned Mahon's order for costs and found that his statement describing an orchestrated litany of lies was made outside his legal authority. Soon after, Mahon resigned from the High Court, but the case did not end there. He appealed to the Privy Council in London, the highest court of appeal at the time. In 1983, the Privy Council dismissed his appeal reluctantly. While praising Mahon's investigation as brilliant and painstaking, the Council agreed that the finding of conspiracy was not supported by sufficient evidence and did breach natural justice. But one point was critical. The Privy Council did not overturn Mahon's conclusions about what caused the crash. His findings on the navigation error and the failure to inform the crew remained intact. Only his criticism of the airline's management conduct was set aside. For decades, the families of Captain Jim Collins and his crew lived under the shadow of a single label: pilot error. They believed the truth had never been fully acknowledged, that the government and the airline had failed to accept their share of responsibility. The weight of that judgment followed the families for years, compounding their grief. Although Justice Mahon's report was finally tabled in Parliament in 1999, real closure remained elusive. It would take another 20 years before a formal apology was made. On the 28th of November 2019, exactly 40 years after the crash, Jacinda Ardern met with the families of the victims. Speaking on behalf of the New Zealand government, she offered a clear and unqualified apology. She stated plainly that the pilots were not responsible for the disaster. The message was echoed by Therese Walsh, chair of Air New Zealand. She admitted that the airline had failed in its duty of care and had not treated the families with the respect they deserved in the years following the tragedy. For the families, the apology didn't take away the loss or the years of pain, but it finally mattered. After decades of blame, hearing the truth brought some relief, and their hearts felt a little lighter at last. We'll be covering more aviation stories like this in the coming days. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss them.